So our last speaker, Natalie O'Brady, is presently the General Manager of the Rape Crisis Society of Trinidad and Tobago and the Trinidad and Tobago Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Victim Support Foundation. She holds a Bachelor's of Science, Behavioral Science, and Master's of Arts in Counseling, and was a recipient of the 2014-2015 Fulbright Hubert Humphrey Fellowship in Public Policy and Public Administration. For several years, she has worked as a clinical therapist and specializes in counseling adult and child survivors of trauma, sexual violence, and family violence. She's an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Psychology of the Caribbean Nazarene College and an e-tutor with the University of the West Indies Open Campus. She has presented several local and regional conferences on issues of sexual violence and child abuse, and co-facilitated several regional training projects for UN Women. Natalie is also a certified crisis interventionist and a trained international facilitator and volunteer of AIDS Link International and a number of other NGOs.
Thank you. Special good evening all. My task is not to sit here and have a very theoretical discussion with you about the issue that is before us, but more to try to give more of an anecdotal account of some of the cases that we would have seen, using a slightly different perspective, because when we start talking about victims, we tend to hear certain constant discourses. But I do think that even as we think about moving forward and implementation of legislation or gaps, we need to shift a little in terms of our focus, our lens. So I want to pivot a little bit from a somewhat different position and this is how it will work. John is a 43-year-old father of 3 who was recently accused of inappropriate sexual behaviors towards his 12-year-old daughter. John's wife of 15 years really wants to save her marriage while protecting her child. Overwhelmed with feelings of regret, shame, and guilt, John slowly begins to share his thoughts. John discloses that for several years his marriage has been in trouble. He says that his wife no longer takes time to greet him when he comes home. She has stopped preparing his meals, and in fact, she no longer shows any interest in him sexually and otherwise. John's wife will often say to their eldest daughter, "Go see about your father." John noted that as time passed, he began to look forward to coming home again. For his daughter will often sit with him and talk about work. She will greet him at the door. She will bring his food for him, and oftentimes, generally show him the care and concern that he desired. Until one day, he found that he crossed the line. He no longer saw her as his daughter, but saw her as a wife. This short scenario oftentimes brings forth visceral responses in some of us. Some of us have so many questions that we would like to have answered, while others just needed to say something and you heard the murmuring in the room. It is still very difficult for many of us to understand why a highly educated, empowered, independent female executive will stay in an abusive relationship for many years and will need tremendous support to leave such. For in itself, it goes against the many theories that says women often stay in relationships because of financial dependency. In today's society, it is said, men are attracted to strong, independent women. Me now want no bag upon back, only handbag and purse. However, when we move beyond the fantasy of the relationship, we often hear words like, she is overbearing, opinionated, trying to wear the pants, and thus must be dominated, oftentimes with aggressive, abusive and often humiliating, dehumanizing, objectifying sexual acts. But where do these stereotypes come from? We heard the discourse this evening. If it is not through the stories which are passed down from generation to generation, like the songs of freedom that were sung in times of slavery, or through our lived relationships, where we teach our children the basics of the role of a man and of a woman, but through our parenting, we say to them, I will make sure that my son can cook, wash, and clean because no woman is making style on him. Or we say to our girls, don't let no man make style on you. Always have your vex money. And don't be afraid to walk. Without taking time to help them to understand the complexity of relationships. How do I satisfy this need to be loved, my desire for sexual intimacy, my yearning for intimate relationships without trading the very power that you have taught me to have? Question, food for thoughts. So permit me for a moment to digress to our opening anecdote. Why was Sherry, John's wife, even considering reconciling with John? What was the child supposed to think when mommy says we are going to live with daddy again? How was little Candace, the child, supposed to live with the guilt of stopping her younger siblings from having a relationship with their father? Or why is it when a marriage fails, the woman is blamed? Why is it that if our children are abused, the woman is blamed? How did the community in which she lived respond? Important questions. So, hence my position. Because when we start talking about gaps and improvement of services, we need to understand that, as I think Gaietry said it, that the persons are responsible for creating these legislation or policy procedures are people like you and I. The persons at the end of the day whom our victim goes to are people like you and I. So when a survivor turns to her religious community and for a moment seeking reprieve, and she is reminded that you signed a contract, till death do you part. Or when you show up for the umpteenth time in the police station to report the abuse on the part of your partner, and your report is taken lightly, or your partner is placed to sit and cool off for a while you are sent home until he cools off and then he comes home and deals with you. We need to understand and constantly be reminded that our community's response is also a reflection of these stereotypes. For when you return home after spending 4 days in the hospital and taking your husband before the court, and your neighbor stops you to say, why you do demand that, girl? Yeah, you know that in being a good wife is all of that you just have to go through. So it is important, and you'll hear me keep saying the word important, that we understand that it's rooted in people who stories that we are not aware of. The police police officer, the medical doctor, the social worker, you and I. Our stories may never be revealed, but it influences our responses. So I want to say that I agree with Gaietry. Is it that we need new legislation? Or is it simply that we need to take time to effectively implement the existing legislations? Is it that our police officers need more education? Or is it beyond education into massaging the concepts of masculinities and femininities that our police officers hold? And it's not just our police officers, but because they are first line defense, they get licks all the time. So, at this point, I do want to pass the microphone back to our worthy moderator.